Thank you, Kenny. Thank you, Diana. And thanks very much to the IACCP and to Bali, Indonesia, for giving me the honor and the pleasure of providing this keynote address. My title isn't exactly what was provided beforehand. It's actually Global Consciousness, Cultural Evolution, Reflexivity, and Sustainability. And I'm going to hit all of those notes over the course of this lecture. When they asked me to give this keynote, I asked them, well, what do you want me to do? And they just said, be inspiring. And then I realized, okay, they gave me the second to the last session in the whole conference, so I better be a little bit inspiring. But at the same time, I'm quite a cynic and slightly realistic. So you'll see if I can strike a balance between these two forces. Okay. So I am a political, social, and cross-cultural psychologist. And this is a famous political theory that emerged at the close of the 20th century by Immanuel Wallerstein. And this is called the world system theory of core periphery relations. And in simple summary, the blue is the core. This is the global economy that was set up by industrialization and colonization. And you can see the blue are pretty much North America, Europe, plus their white colonies and Japan. This is slightly updated because it's this map is from 2000. This map is slightly advanced because then it also describes a semi-periphery of states that are advancing, but still surrounding this core. And then, of course, huge areas of the globe that are red that are on the periphery. So this is the structure of the global economy, the structure of influence that was set up by historical processes from about the 16th century on. And they condition, I think, everything that we experience as cross-cultural variability within the lens of political psychology and political power. So this is what I'm going to interrogate, and everything I'm going to talk about is within this framework, because the framework is starting to fall apart. Okay, so this is the key, is that you imagine that this system is going to last forever, but it won't. And as people start seeing that that system is falling apart, it produces a lot of anxiety. The system hit its peak at around 1990. This was in the collapse of the Soviet Union. And this chap here is, this chap here is Francis Fukuyama, and he wrote a book called End of History and the Last Man, where he essentially reviewed philosophy and history and came to the conclusion that liberal democracy was the best system of governance for all people for all time. And this was an incredibly popular book around the 1990s. It gave Fukuyama tremendous currency in Washington, D.C., London, because essentially he was telling the people in power what they wanted to hear. What did the rulers of the world do, this incredibly privileged position, after the communist bloc and the USSR collapsed in the 89 through 90? They made the world safe for billionaires. So effectively, from the 90s on, what we've seen is a global increase in economic inequality. So every single country virtually in the world is more economically unequal now than it was in 1990. But the world as a whole is not more unequal, because considerable amounts of the wealth flowed from the core to the semi-periphery. So China and India are much wealthier now than they were in 1990. And this, of course, has produced tremendous anxiety in the United States, which has responded with such slogans as MAGA, make America great again. And so this is the context for things, but it's very interesting when we consider why this might have been. this inequality was definitely produced by neoliberalism, by the choices of the 1% who drive the global economy and the global system within this time period. They had the opportunity to do whatever they wanted because at that point, the United States in 91 was pretty much unrivaled, and that's what it chose to do. Okay, so I'm not being inspiring so far because we have to leave the background for the reality of what's been happening on this planet for the last 30 some years. Don't worry, we're going to get there. So, oh, sorry. I do have to show. So, New Zealand, by the way, is one of the more sane places left in the core. So we actually don't have a particular populist politician that blames everything on the immigrants, but our Gini index of inequality is much higher now than it was then. So this is quite a global phenomenon. I'm sure we're going to have our populist politician sooner or later. So what does that do? We have a much more multipolar world. You can't simply dismiss China the way you could 35 years ago. You can't dismiss India the way you could 20 or 35 years ago. So we can see the world moving in many different directions, which produces a lot of tension. So within the core states, you have these populist movements arising in most of the countries. And within the peripheral, the semi-periphery, we have reactions. And so we're being pulled in many different directions. And of course, with all this economic inequality, we have climate change as well. So the climate change is something that's very difficult because it requires everyone on the planet to pull together to solve this problem. But what we have the moment is, say, Vladimir, Donald. So Vladimir and Xi Jinping are probably against Donald. And of course, there's a lot of risk in that. Within that structure of power, oops, sorry. What do we do? So the first thing I do is to remind you, we need to just relax and laugh. This is from a famous comedian when I was growing up called Mel Brooks. And he had a movie called Blazing Saddle. And there's a really dumb, strong guy called Mongo. And Mongo said, Mongo just pawn in game of life. So you're not laughing very much. But anyway, it was probably before most of your times. I think the first thing is to realize, you know what? Everything I've talked about beforehand is beyond my pay grade. So it's right that it brings you down because why should we worry about it? We might be able to have some anxiety about, but what can we do about it? And I think these macro level factors are things that we as individuals at mid-level positions in society have very much difficulty influencing. However, from a subjective position, I'm going to articulate a particular pathway towards relevance going forward. So we'll move slowly into the hopefully inspirational part of things. Once you get into this, your power is limited. So this pathway that I'm talking about won't apply to everyone equally, but I hope that it'll be at least a little bit relevant for everyone in this room, because I imagine not too many people of the 0.1% are listening to this lecture at the moment. So what gave me a lot of peace was going back to this idea of the marginal man. It came up with the idea, Robert Ezra Park came up with this idea around 1950. He's a white man, but quite progressive in this era. And he describes someone like me as a marginal type. Okay, so I'm somebody who's born in Taiwan, emigrated to the United States, has never lived in one place longer than 8 years. So Park said that marginal types are able to look with a certain degree of critical attachment upon the diverse worlds of their parents, feeling themselves not quite at home in either. So I would describe myself as a marginal type because I'm never in the majority in any situation. Even when I'm giving a keynote here in this address, which is fairly close, I still think that I'm a minority. This is a mentality, but I've learned to embrace and to appreciate that position, because when global systems are unjust and unequal and requiring change, then a marginal person is very much motivated to be a source of the change as opposed to reproducing the existing hegemony. There is a cost that comes with this. And the cost, I think, Park describes very accurately as spiritual instability, intensified self-consciousness, restlessness, and well, I don't go with the malaise, but at least the first three. So those were things that I think many migrants experience in their youth, growing up and trying to adapt to their host cultures. But what I also find is that marginal types are good at interrogating their own subjective positioning. We're very aware of the power around us and how we are not central to that power. But that's a good thing, not a bad thing, in a world of increasing economic inequality. And I think the key here is that we need to be unapologetically dynamic about it. So we're all dynamic. We all start off young and we acquire a set of skills. For me, it was learning how to use my intellect. For my profession, I learned how to develop a craft. And for me, that craft all revolves around building up a social network. So I am somewhat at home here because as I look around, there are many people who are deeply involved with my social network that have influenced the work that I'm presenting here. It's not possible to do this alone, but that's just the material side of things. My father, his name is Liu Shuxian. He is a Neo-Confucian philosopher. And in that philosophy, you always look for the soul or the spirit. And that probably needs to complement these material things. And over time, I've learned more how to trust my instincts, to intuit a path to higher interconnectedness. So it's that sensitivity to when you can make a difference in a world that's largely unequal and growing in corruption that I'd like to articulate over the remaining time in this lecture through a lot of empirical examples. So to summarize the background, we live in a world where the United States is still the most powerful state in the world, but no longer the sole hegemonic power as it was in the 1990s. We live in a world of very simple calculus in terms of the political power dynamics of the world is this plus this cannot be this plus that. So the total calculus is we have to stay at peace, and therefore we need to rise above these national consciousness, these national divisions that are the product and the maker of the world that we know it, the world of colonization, the world of systems theory that Wallerstein authored at the close of the 20th century. How do we do this? Well, I'm just the son of a philosopher, so I started out by thinking of this idea of global consciousness. How do we transcend these differences? From a philosophical perspective, there was no empirical data in this theory paper. I define global consciousness as a knowledge of both the interconnectedness and difference of humankind and a will to take moral actions in a reflexive and situated manner on its behalf. So this is kind of my mantra that I've been developing over the last decade or so, and I think I've refined how to do this. The weakness of this approach, of course, is it's not a very empiricist type of approach. It's very philosophical, but I think it's very broad, and I want to go over certain key points of it. To really achieve global consciousness, you need to be regularly aware of both the interconnectedness and the difference of the heterogeneity between you and others. I think it applies to everyone, including the cross-cultural psychologists in this room, because it's very easy to move and emphasize difference more, that challenges this interdependence, and sometimes hard to get into this interconnectedness that drives greater connectedness. This is a natural dynamic. There's no way it's going to go away. So a marginal person accepts that's normal. And the feelings of anxiety, maybe depression that come through it are also normal. And how you build into it from the perspective of Chinese philosophy is through an inner human heartedness that we call Ren. And the behavior that's the most basic to this kind of behavior is the golden rule. It's in the Christian tradition, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. In the Confucian traditions is 己所不欲，勿施于人. And that means don't do to other people what you don't want to do to them to do to you. So these, the philosophers thought this was the closest thing to a universal rule of pro-sociality. And of course, nobody can stay there all the time. And so in modern psychology, we see that there's action identity. It's multi-layered, and it's a relative minority of the time that you will be at this level of global consciousness. You know, if you're a mother and your child is hungry for milk, you're not going to be at the level of global consciousness. You're going to move to another level, and that's great. Within this kind of dynamic approach, you need people working together to achieve different things. I freely admit I am not the greatest of scientists. I'm the son of a philosopher and a translator. I think this conference is great in that we had an earlier keynote by somebody who presented some great science. Thanks, Russell. That was awesome. I aim for lower goals. And one was, how can we even properly measure this global consciousness? Because I wasn't responsible for doing it. And in fact, it was Angela Leung. When I read her scale on cosmopolitan orientation, I thought, wow, this is really sweet. It has really nice structure, only 3 factors, 15 items. So it's and it basically comes from a deep review of the literature on cosmopolitanism, which dates back to the Greeks. So to reduce that to 15 items and 3 factors is quite a feat. And I'll show you the psychometric qualities of this that I consider to be one concrete measure of global consciousness in a while. The key thing in this measure that I think is very powerful is global pro-sociality. I'm not going to read all the items, but this kind of human-heartedness, it really operationalizes this open-heartedness to all people everywhere. And that really is a little bit of an antidote to the parochialism that we see as a dominant force today. Philosophically, probably this openness is very important. So when I do the big 5 thing myself, I'm really high on openness. And that's the thing that probably characterizes me the most. And the last aspect is this respecting cultural differences. So you don't try to import your own life ways to situations where they don't belong. You're not trying to be hegemonic, you're trying to be interconnected. So at the time, Angela had not tested her model in very many countries. And as a marginal man, I very rarely get big grants, but I was in the fortunate position of having a big grant around this time. And so we put the cosmopolitan orientation measure and applied it to pretty good samples, stratified samples of about 500 in 19 countries. And for this group, I'll just say it had metric invariance, which means that the correlations between measures are reliable across different contexts. And what you see is, this is too detailed, but let me just give you some of the highlights. First of all, that the 3 factors of cosmopolitanism, their correlations with all these demographic and structural factors are all quite low. Okay, they're significant, but when you have an N of 9,000 8,640. Lots of things are going to be significant. These effect sizes are small. And there is a personality component that feeds in to cosmopolitanism, the strongest single one being agreeableness leading to global prosociality. Confession, I'm not naturally agreeable. Sometimes I can be downright cranky. So anyway, but you can see that, whoops, none of these these beta coefficients are huge. So what it's telling you is that there's a lot of room for individual difference and personal growth. So global consciousness is something that is not determined by any number of structural factors in society, nor by which might be possibly more genetically based features of personality. The literature on cosmopolitanism, basically, it's quite clear in terms of its effects. So these three, they predict around the planet better attitudes towards immigrants and lower seeing immigration as a threat, and for the most part, lower social dominance orientation, which is wanting to see the in-group as dominant over the out-group. And these effects are stronger in wealthy countries, interaction. They also relate to positive global civic attitudes, like trust in the UN, climate change caused by humans, and governments have a responsibility to ameliorate these. So Angela's work continues to be rooted in environmental sustainability and environmental psychology. So you want to pursue this, look up cosmopolitan orientation. Angela Leung, lots and lots of wonderful work that she continues to do in this regard. However, I'm not the same kind of a theorist as Angela. I think a lot about evolutionary psychology and evolutionary theory. There's a problem with this global consciousness from an evolutionary perspective. It seems like it might be a little bit naive. Okay? First of all, it's not likely to be a personality trait. And why? Because if we look at evolutionary science, a very seminal paper for me was published by Choi and Bowles. It was a simulation, a beautiful simulation that predicts that tolerant altruists, these are globally conscious people, cannot survive competition in a world where their genes are in competition with tolerant non-altruists. Okay, so tolerant non-altruists are rational choice people, right? They don't sacrifice their own self-interest for anybody, but they also don't discriminate much between the in-group and the out-group. Okay, that's rational choice. And then they also lose against the other group that's also can survive cultural evolution, which is the parochial altruist. Altruist in this context is not the typical use of altruist. It means somebody who's willing to sacrifice their own well-being on behalf of their in-group. So typically this means a warrior, right? So somebody goes out, risks getting killed for the benefit of the group. It's not self-interest to do that. The self-interest thing is to run away. But if everyone in your group runs away every time you get into a fight, your group is not going to exist and your genes are not going to propagate very well in a warlike environment. Okay, so is everybody following this logic? So according to this simulation, in-group favoring cooperators have a better chance of survival than general cooperators. Okay, and globally conscious people tend to be general cooperators. So how are we going to deal with this? Oh, sorry. Yeah, I forgot that. Now I gave away the secret. I was going to say, is there any evidence for this? This is just a computer simulation. What is the evidence for this? Why did I put up this guy's picture? Anybody know? No? Okay, who is he, do you think? Genghis Khan. Why did I put up Genghis Khan? That's right. See, this is why this man is the president. Because there are more descendants living on this planet today from this man, Genghis Khan, than any other traceable human in the world. Okay? What does that say about our evolutionary genetic base? Okay? And I'm pretty sure that Genghis Khan didn't get that status by being a sensitive New Age guy. Okay, I won't say more because, yeah, but you can imagine how he became the man with the most genetic material on this planet today. Okay, so that's some of the evidence for this. And it moves in the direction of this kind of group-based evolution where processes like colonization, warfare are part of the processes that produce humanity today. And how are we going to evolve towards global consciousness if that is in our genetic heritage? Well, you got to be optimistic, right? So there, Genghis is in this kind of mode. We're moving into Homo economicus, right? So we don't have to be as fierce. Some of these processes that happen is Genghis Khan, the religion that he and the Mongolians and the steppe people subscribed to were shamanistic tribal religions. Whereas Noran Zion, one of Joe Hendrick's colleagues at University of British Columbia, he had an idea of big gods. And these are supernatural agents with unlimited monitoring and punishing capabilities, together with moralistic concerns, facilitating pro-sociality on a large scale. So this is a story, highly controversial. Well, some people like Noran Zion, some people don't like Noran Zion, but this is the idea that this is within recorded history, that this massive axial age religions came into being, and they make the Genghis Khan type less able to reproduce now in the wake of these big gods religion than they were able to back in the 13th century. Things are changing, and it's certainly a gentler world now than it was in the 13th century. And the takeaway message for me is when I examine things like the Mongols spreading around the world, the colonization by the Europeans, is that group selection, which was highly controversial in the 20th century, is becoming more and more considered a part of cultural evolution in the 21st century. So we as social psychologists, cross-cultural psychologists, were right all the time. It isn't simply at the individual level, it's at the group level, and then you have to figure out where do you move, within what collectivities can you contribute to as a tolerant altruist? How do you strengthen those collectivities so they grow as opposed to shrink? Well, what religion you belong to and who you listen to actually matters. So religion is much bigger than us. And the very nice thing about the emerging research on global consciousness, on identification with all humanity, is that those features are positively, not negatively correlated with religiosity and membership in the big religions, the Noran Zion big God religions. So in the research that Robert and I did, Robert Zhang, the slight positive correlation across the same 19 cultures of global pro-sociality with personal religiosity, no consistent correlation between cosmopolitan orientation and organizational religiosity. And then the other positive, which goes against MAGA and all those that, all these immigrants are going to just destroy our culture and erase our cultural values, is that nationalism is actually slightly positively correlated with both global pro-sociality and respect for cultural diversity in this data set. So our empirical data suggests that global consciousness is not going to replace religiosity and nationalism. It's going to grow from the fertile soils that came before. It needs to select the best of these features, transform them to achieve the better world we'd like to see for our children. But it's going to be really hard. we're going to flip back to that globe I showed you before, those giant flags with the 600-pound gorillas flexing and ready to womp on each other. These are the different structures of trust that empirically we have identified between China and liberal democracy. So we had about a 25 item measure of trust in all of the different institutions and groups in society. And the structure, you'll have to read the details somewhere else. This is published a paper by Robert Sung. What happens is that in the Chinese structure of trust, the amount of powerful institutions that people think belong to central government is unreplicated anywhere else in the 19 countries that we looked at. This is the centralization of power in the central government. And of course, this is not a liberal position. Okay? Now, by the way, these ones, the liberal democratic, they applied more to Japan, Korea, and South Korea and Taiwan. But these three East Asian cultures also did not fit into the Western model. So the Western model was essentially Western Europe, North America, and a few of the Latin countries in South America. Their model of trust did not fit in Japan, Korea, or Taiwan. So these cultures somewhat resonated here and somewhat resonated here. So you can always be in between two spaces, even when they're flexing and getting ready to beat the tar out of each other. Okay, which is a very frightening prospect for humanity. But there's a lot of space in between where the two can decide to mutually coexist. What's the empirical proof for this? This is a paper that I co-wrote with Tian Xie, who's also another colleague here in this room. These are Xi Jinping's speeches about the Belt and Road Initiative. This is essentially China's early 21st century strategy for economic expansion. So it gets a lot of negative press in the Western societies, but honestly, Western societies' record of development in places like Africa and Central Asia, they have very little basis to complain about anybody else doing anything. Okay? So this rhetoric, it's actually beautiful rhetoric. I mean, I would imagine that Katharina or I could write sentences like this, where Xi Jinping's speechwriter, when he wrote this, interconnection and interdependence between countries are crucial for human survival. The forces for peace far outweigh factors causing war, and the trend of our times towards peace, development, cooperation, and win-win outcomes has gained stronger momentum. Those were in better days, right? But this can change with the wind. And so with us as researchers, we just have to keep going in the same direction. And when the wind flows in the right way, you can be of influence. Because this is one of Xi's official speeches that are not widely recognized in Western media, but is part of their most important economic strategy for the 21st century. Okay, going back to this. My previous work has shown that a previously dominant group tries to hold on to its dominance a lot longer than the newly rising group tries to increase in its dominance before the previously hegemonic group is ready to give it up. So I think each one in your room, for the next slide, just think to yourself, what is my emotional reaction to this picture? Now, what's your emotional reaction to that picture? Are you comfortable with it? Okay. So these are the, I'm not gonna, not audience participation. System, but the fact that the second most powerful state in the world promotes a representation like that. Okay. is cosmopolitanism enough to measure global consciousness? No, it's not. So I don't want to get obsessed about measurement. We're very fortunate. The first time I've ever met Katharina Hammer in person, she's worked with Sam McFarlane for a long time. He produced the first and most used scale in terms of measuring this thing, identification with all humanity. And it's Katharina's work that distinguishes bond with all humanity. This is a cognitive motivational feature of global consciousness that's not in Leung cosmopolitan orientation. Her concern for all humanity is very similar to global prosociality, so I won't go into the item. But these are also another feature of global consciousness, and it's great that different researchers find different things to understand something that we will hopefully work on in common. And last but not least, how do we conceptualize global consciousness? It's not only what's in global consciousness, but what is not in global consciousness. So the last feature of global consciousness is Sylvia Chen, editor of Journal Cross Cultural Psychology at the moment. Her version of global orientations, on the one hand, has multicultural acquisition, very similar to respect for cultural diversity, but located within the acculturation literature. But for Go, she also thought that maybe a negative version of parochialism. So ethnic protection also might be a negative against global consciousness. What are the results? Ethnic protection has a very low negative correlation with all the other features of global consciousness. So global consciousness is not a negative version of national parochialism. Parochialism is just something else. So that means global consciousness can possibly survive this element of cooperation. If you have to go directly against parochial altruism, you're probably going to lose. It doesn't directly go against that. Coming to a close. Let me see, what time is it right now? 3:13. Okay. In this group, people are really into things like scalar invariance. For the scales that I've talked to you about so far with our data set, we do not get scalar invariance. But every time I present cross-cultural data, people always say, James, who has the most global consciousness and who has the least? Okay, and we can't really say that exactly because we do not have scalar invariance. But if you want to find out about scalar invariance, talk to Katharina Hammer. You can stand up and say hello to them because, yeah, she has scalar invariance with IWAP, but on a much smaller, narrow range of people, which are university students. So we did a more approximation using latent profile analysis. It's essentially a cluster analysis that will give you a fit statistic. And so we found high, medium, low global consciousness profiles using latent profile analysis. And you can see that ethnic protection doesn't differentiate. So we could easily drop that and it doesn't affect this. So here it is now, wait for it. Who's highest among Sylvia's 35 country data set on global consciousness? Think about what it is. I'm willing to bet no one in this room knows who it is, okay? Or no, won't even be close. Okay. Highest percentage of people with global consciousness in this 35 country data set, Nigeria. Number 2, UAE. Number 3, Mexico. Number 4, Philippines. Number 5, Brazil. And a big applause for our host, Indonesia. The big 600-pound gorillas that want to fight are right in the middle, right? And more ethnically and culturally homogeneous societies like South Korea, Japan, and Finland are on the bottom. And very surprising, I don't know if we have any Dutch people in the room. This was a shock to me. Netherlands down here, and then this was a shock to me. Hong Kong, what happened, Sylvia, to Hong Kong? Okay. The excuse can be, well, you don't have scalar invariance. This is not a precise comparison, but it's certainly something that close off with that. So we use game theory. We have people classified as high, medium, or low in global consciousness. And again, I got some money. I do get money sometimes. And what we did is we had them play various games. So these games are the dictator game. I think you've encountered this before. Basically, I have all the money. How much am I going to give to you? If I'm nice, I'm benevolent. I could keep it all myself. The prisoner's dilemma, most people know. Am I going to cooperate or am I going to screw you over so I get more money? And the public goods game is basically, am I going to contribute to a public good at my own cost? And what happens is in this sixth society where we're paying them real money, it's not a lot of money, but it's real money. In every society except Hong Kong, the high global consciousness is more altruistic and benevolent than low or medium global consciousness. So these are people paying money, real money. They either keep it themselves or donate it to an outgroup charity. And you can see that this is true, that there's less parochialism across all these games. And so high global consciousness people are more charitable, less exploitative, more sacrificing, self-sacrificing for public good. This is good news for the planet, but bad news for the individual. Because the only way for such behavior to be profitable for the individual is for them to find like-minded others and form clusters of mutual cooperation, because the world in general will contain many people who want to exploit such an orientation. That feature is reduced if you have rule of law in a society. So in our experiments, the negative part of it is when you add up the money they earn across the 6 experimental games, the globally conscious people would always earn less than the other. Okay? But there's always a but, because I want to end with inspiration rather than pessimism, right? Where does global consciousness give you survival value? What just recently hit the planet? The pandemic. This is work by Sylvia Chen and colleagues in which it shows that global consciousness moves. Where did I go? Global consciousness essentially, despite all these other control, predicts all of these features of pandemic prevention. So if it helps in the case of pandemic, that provides huge survival advantages, especially if you're in a tight cluster compared to other people who say that, COVID-19 is just a hoax and things like that. So I think Henny is really wanting me to stop right now. So I have more, but I'll probably show it later on when people ask the right questions that need to be asked. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor. It was inspiring too. So the mission accomplished. So we have now some time for question from the audience. I think I would like to invite the questions from our online viewers. Maybe can the operator help me to show the online platform, please? Ada pertanyaan online? Okay, so far there is no question from the online platform, so I would like to invite question from the audience here. You can just raise, okay, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the lecture. I just would like to maybe argue or discuss the last conclusion you made, because regarding, for example, COVID-19, we have results showing that people high in identification of humanity are more willing to work for the whole world to get rid of the pandemic, which is profitable for everyone, right? So they want to follow the rules, wear masks, social distancing, with higher willingness to vaccinate. So this is actually pro everyone, but also for them, it's profitable. So maybe it's not, such crazy evolutionary thing to have this global orientation, and also regarding global crises we have, climate crisis, migration crisis, and many other crises. If we don't work together, we're gonna die. Humanity will end. So I think this is actually very important for the survival of everyone to have more and more. And I'm curious about your opinion on this a little bit maybe broader view. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I think Henny, I'm going to blame Henny because we were rushing too much. The last slide is exactly what you said. People who are high in global consciousness are better at all the pandemic prevention features, from the attitudinal towards the behavioral. I think what Sylvia did was they had to write some comment on the global, the online panel. That was the behavior that was in favor of preventing pandemic. Yeah, so the data are actually in complete agreement.
Sorry about that, Professor. I was complete. Okay, so the second question, please. I think we still have one question to answer before we move to the next keynote speaker. Would you please introduce yourself?
Hi, hello, I'm
Straightforward.
Anka Minescu, and I'm fascinated by your philosophical approach. And I have a question about that. You were talking about having that awareness. So I can figure out that, okay, in intercultural competence, we also want to be aware of what we have in common and different. I can handle that. Then you had the moral, what was it? Interdependence. Okay, we have laws for that also. We can kind of, the normative pressure. But then you also said we need reflexivity. And I would like to hear some inspirational hope that we can create spaces for this reflexivity, or where is it? Especially in this kind of craziness of 10-second attention span of the future generations kind of fear that I have.
Thank you for that, Anka. Can I put up my PowerPoint again, please? So there the answers in the last few slides. So how do you do this? Okay. Okay, here. For me, what global consciousness does, it habituates me to being comfortable in situations I would otherwise not be comfortable in, because I'm highly reflexive of I'm uncomfortable, but I ought to be uncomfortable. Why? This big guy is Dave Latelli. He's kind of my hero. He's a Maori Pacific guy. He's a big guy. He's an ex-boxer, and he's famous in Aotearoa, New Zealand. He has 250,000 fans on Twitter and all that kind of stuff because he advocates for poor Maori and Pacific people living in South Auckland and fighting or living with obesity. So the mainstream positions them as their fault. You can't control your own way. Dave, he has a whole different discourse. And he says some stuff that I would never say in a million years. He comes from a gang background. So his father was in gangs. So that reflexivity means when I enter into a space, another collective space, I'm very cautious about what it is I say and what it is I do. I'm looking around for cues. What should I do in this space? I'm very cautious. I do not impose my values, even if he says things that are not politically correct. And believe you me, Dave Latelli doesn't do politically correct to anyone. Okay? But how do I help in something like that? Well, what we're doing is an evaluation of the effectiveness of his weight loss program to actually delivering weight loss for the people he claims to represent. So in this process, the globally conscious part is that before Dave looked down on research. But what I did was, Dave, what we have to do here is we'll co-design the evaluation. I asked him, what kind of criteria do you want for your participants? And he said, Jim, if they could tie their shoelaces, that'd be really good. Okay? The average weight of people that we evaluated was 180 kilograms at the start. All right? They only lost 7 kilograms, but the key finding, and this is where we can employ our talents in the service of other people doing good. Dave is not oriented to his global consciousness. He is oriented to doing good for his community, Maori Pacific South Auckland. What I said was, hey, let's think about mental health. So my contribution to this effort is to put in the PHQ-9, which is a measure of depressive symptoms. The effect size of that is much bigger than the effect size of losing that 7 kilograms of weight. Okay? Within the 12-week program of his weight loss, there at the beginning, 2/3 of the participants showed severe depressive symptoms. I know that David then saved the lives of one person, because when you ask the PHQ-9 question on suicidal ideation, you must have a professional present. And we had a nurse on site who looked after the person. So this is this collaboration, this coalition between a primary health organization, the NGO, and the researchers, all operating in a reflexive manner, and everybody realizing in this situation, BBM, this marginal organization, is the leader, and we are followers. And I'm happy to say this paper is almost published, almost through to health psychology, but it's entirely within the paradigm of service. Thank you.